Recording. Great. Thank you all for joining us this evening. This is our meeting of the Ad hoc Affordable Housing Committee, and I am super excited that we have a guest speaker today. Michelle, before we introduce and speak on our guest speaker, should we take care of our housekeeping? Did we do a public comment on this one?
Yes, we have a couple people on. If you'd like to make public comment, please use the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your screen and we'll bring you over to speak. If you're dialed in on a phone, press *9. I don't see anybody.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say I don't see anybody either, so terrific. All right, so we will close public participation and then acceptance of the minutes from our special meeting of April 29th of 2025. Does anyone have any additions, corrections, omissions?
I do.
Okay, Miss Edie.
There was just a couple that I saw. Page 3, the first paragraph, it had my name asking the question about the lieu payments and lieu of payments. It was Barbara Smith who asked that question.
Okay,
And
thank you.
Same page, second paragraph, second to last line, it says loan. It just was misspelled. It should be LOAN.
Okay, thank you.
That's all I can see so far. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else with any additions or corrections? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor, please vote for, and I'm sorry, Jalen?
I was just voting in favor, sorry.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Please show by a show of hand in favor of accepting the minutes. Terrific, and we do have a quorum, so, and I see 4 votes, so we are ready to go. Okay. And the record should also note that Councilmember Lopez has joined us, who is not a member of our committee, but obviously very welcome for this important conversation. So I then will move us on to the main event of this evening, which is a guest lecture by Don Poland, who is an expert in land use planning with a particular specialty in tax incentives and the ways that tax incentives can be used to assist in community development, to assist in affordable housing development. And he is particularly an expert, which we are very grateful for, in the ways that this has played out in Connecticut and in other states and locations that have sort of similar demographics and challenges and restrictions to Connecticut. So I could not think of a better person to talk to us tonight about our options in Norwalk as we begin to explore what else we can do to incentivize affordable housing development that addresses the particular gaps that have been identified in our affordable housing plan. And in particular, just to give context for everyone who might be listening, there is a new-ish, not immediately new, but new-ish Connecticut state law, 1265B, that allows for more targeted incentives than had previously been permissible. Norwalk has not currently made use of that law, and one of the questions really for this committee is, do we want to make a recommendation to planning and zoning or to the ordinance committee or both to utilize our authority under that state statute. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. Poland. I'm really excited to hear from you. And just so the committee members know, the goal is to have some presentation and then plenty of time for us to ask questions.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Good evening. Just give me a moment here while I sort out my screens. Okay. For the record, my name is Don Poland. I'm with the firm of Goldman York Property Advisors based in East Hartford, Connecticut. And then I'm going to be talking to you about tax abatements and trying to provide kind of an overview and at the same time provide some specific cases and provide some insights into how they are used. So for this introduction, the presentation will seek out to provide an overview of tax abatements and tax fixing agreements. To accomplish this, we'll explore the statutory authority, which was just mentioned. Also, financial feasibility and return on investments. We'll go through some sample pro formas. I'll explain kind of those cases to you. And then I'll talk or wrap up with some thoughts on tax incentive policies. Before I actually get into the context here, I want to provide some further context. Two things. One, if 15 years ago, if you asked me, I'd be involved in tax abatements, I would have said no. And two, if 15 years ago you asked me that tax abatements would become common for residential development, I would also have said no. But it's really somewhere around 2015 started seeing this shift away from tax abatements just for economic development into the realm of tax abatements for multifamily residential development. And what really kind of drove that, especially in the Hartford area, was high costs with moderate returns, making it ultimately very challenging to pull off development. I don't think that's been the same overall down in Fairfield County. I think the returns on rents are much higher, and therefore it probably didn't play out in the same way. So another note to make is, in general, I'm pretty fiscally conservative. So I'd also say 15 years ago, if you asked me if I supported tax abatements, I would have said no. But I've since recognized that was kind of that would have been a statement out of ignorance, isn't in a lack of understanding on how a tax abatement can work and should work. And that's what I'm going to try and get at in this presentation. So some background context here as one of my dogs invades the room. Tax abatements are often viewed as giveaways to wealthy developers or as a form of corporate welfare. And I want to make it clear that this is not the case or should not be the case, especially if the abatements are done strategically. Tax abatements too often are offered as a one-size-fits-all incentive. I've seen a lot of communities that adopt policies that say, yeah, we're willing to give a 50% tax abatement, for X development. We want this kind of development, and in order to attract it, we're willing to offer that. In that sense, I would argue, yeah, that is kind of just a giveaway, because if a developer realizes that they can pull this development off in your community, and they can also get a 50% tax abatement for it, why not, right? So the important point here is tax abatements should be founded in public policy objectives like affordable housing, and should be based on need. That is the financial feasibility of the development. How does the abatement actually interact with the financial feasibility of the development? And that's where much of my work has been over the past 10 years when dealing with these. So statutory authority, section 1265B, shown here on this slide. Couple things. One, the legislature last year did two tweaks to this statute. One is, or actually I think there were three tweaks, but one was they extended it out to 30 years. I believe previously it was 20 years that you could give an abatement for. In general, I am not a fan of going beyond 10 years on tax abatements, but in the context of affordable housing, that is one place where I would say a 30-year term may actually make sense, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Number two is they added personal property tax to it. That municipality could abate personal property taxes. That wasn't previously the case. It was only real property. I'm still struggling with that one. I'm not sure how I feel about it. But if we're talking about housing and affordable housing, then we're really not talking about personal property taxes. So I'll just stay away from that one for tonight. And then this airspace tax abatement that was added. And then ultimately down here, what do the can the abatements be used for? And personal property improvements to be constructed are for at least one of the following: office uses, retail uses. I'm going to skip below here the manufacturing, warehousing, structured multi-level parking, and a bunch of other things. But you see in here, for residential properties consisting of 4 or more dwelling units in 2 categories. Basically, from my interpretation, multifamily housing. If it's 4 or more units, you can actually use the tax abatement authority in that context. And also mixed use developments. So if you have a development that has a housing component to it, it can be used in that case also, a commercial development with a housing component. So financial feasibility and return on investment. This is kind of the real estate side of things, but I want to start off by showing you, these are 10 tax abatements that I've been involved in since 2015. 9 are within the Hartford region. All 10 are outside of the city of Hartford. My point with that is that this is something that not just cities do anymore. Suburbs and even small towns are now engaging in tax abatements. 4 are housing only developments. 6 of them are mixed use, and two of them include affordable housing units within them. If you'll notice here, these are all different numbers of years and percents of abatements that were granted. And this is because none of these were done just for the sole fact of let's give an abatement. They were actually done based on ultimately the financial need. And my role that I've played in these was either representing the developer, helping to negotiate with the town on the tax abatement, or representing the town, helping them negotiate with the developer in the tax abatement. In both circumstances, in my role, in our role as Goldman York, the developer provides us with their pro forma. They provide us with all their financials and explain to us, how they're doing this development financially and why it needs a tax abatement. And I'll show you that through some of our case studies to better explain some of the nuances going on here. So before we get to that, just this generalized look at market conditions and some basic calculations that are easy to perform to start making just a general kind of assessment of, may we be entering into the realm of needing a tax abatement? So these were some rent analysis that we did back in 2022 in West Hartford, Wethersfield, and East Hartford. These are the types of units. These are the square footages of the units. These are the average rents. And then these are the average rents per square feet. Most of this was existing product, not new product, which would have run higher. Down here, we have approximate affordable rents. Similar size units, right? Using the rents actually from West Hartford, there was a reason for that in this context. And then what is the 80% AMI fair market rent? And what does that work out to in square footage per square foot? So if we go over here, this is just a simple basic calculation that I do all the time on different types of developments to see if there's market feasibility. And I'm assuming 200 units at 900 square feet a unit. I'm basically kind of splitting the difference between 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms. And I'm basically assuming there's going to be 101 bedrooms, 102 bedrooms. Construction cost, $240 a square foot. That works out to 180,000 square feet. we've got a $40 million project here. Market rents, $2.15 per square foot, or $25.80 per square foot per year. Divide the 43 million by 10 years, you get 4 million per year. Divide that by the 180,000 square feet, you get $24. Divide that by 12 months. Minimum rent, you would need $2 a square foot on this $43 million project to actually have it be feasible. And what we're seeing is market rents are at $2.15. They're higher. So yes, this project, really basic calculations here, but at this point we can kind of say, yeah, this is probably feasible. Now I don't have to redo the calculations. So look at these rents, $2.38, 192. That's what gave us the 215 as the average, right? And now come down here to the affordable rents, 160 and 127. If I did the same calculations again, there is no way at these rents that this development is going to come up market feasible. It's just not going to generate enough income to actually cover the cost of building it. And that's the point here. When we start talking about affordable units, then we start having some fiscal challenges on the financial feasibility. So why is public participation often necessary? Return on investments. Projects must achieve returns, meaning they must attract investors, either debt or equity, or they don't get built. Typically, returns on investments, investors are typically looking for 12 to 18%. Now, I know a lot of people jump out and be like, oh my God, it's just developers getting really wealthy. You have to remember that high risk in real estate development. If we start the idea today, it's probably 5 years before it gets built and actually starts producing income. The economy can crash, tariffs can come into play, supply chains can go away, all those things can occur. And planning and zoning can also deny the project, early in, right? So there's high risk here, and that's why the returns have to be high. So it's the only way to attract equity. So typical returns on investments reflects the risk in real estate development, varies by the conditions of the market, growth and affluence, urban versus suburban, Northeastern United States versus Southwestern United States. All of those things are going to come into play here. So this sheet here, actually, this slide comes from a report we had done for a client looking at kind of this idea of why is public participation necessary. This was a government agency. So multifamily development assumptions, examples, return on investment analysis with no public participation. Required ROI, 12 to 18%. Development cost, $250 a square feet. Market rents, $2.35. Operating expenses, almost $10. Net rents, $18. Return on investment, when you run the pro forma and run the numbers, comes out to 7.33, well below the 12%, minimum 12% that's needed. So example, it illustrates the need for public participation. If there is a public need for this development, if the government wants it to occur, they're going to have to participate. Without public participation, the development will not be built. It's dead in the water. You're not going to attract investors, and it's not going to get built. Now, that may not be a bad thing. Maybe you don't actually want the development, and it goes away. But if there is a public need, if there is, say, something like affordable housing that you're trying to achieve, then that kind of public purpose comes into play in the decision as to, do we as government participate in this project? The next slide is redoing the analysis, assuming, and I'm not saying this is a tax abatement, this could be multiple forms of public assistance. There could be loans, there could be grants, there could be abatements. But if you throw in, say, 40% participation on the public level, redo the same numbers, then the return on investment comes to 1222. And this developer could now actually attract the debt and equity investors into the project. That ultimately public participation can allow this project to go forward. I'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. Oh, let me go back to here just to where I said, if public doesn't participate, it doesn't get built. This is where we have to remember in the context of the abatement. There's this idea that an abatement is just a giveaway, right? We're just giving money away. At the end of the day, it's money you wouldn't otherwise have. If you're truly doing it to help the development be financially feasible, the development either doesn't happen or you participate with an abatement that makes it feasible. And now you actually have those taxes to abate. So I think that needs to be kept in perspective. So at the end of the day, though, in Hartford, 2015, in the Hartford region, the problem we were trying to solve was really kind of soft market conditions. As I told you, construction costs were really high and rents were marginal. That's what we were trying to overcome, that weakness on the return on investment due to the marginal rents. Affordable housing becomes more complex than dealing with kind of just those market conditions. So affordable housing policies typically shift cost burden to the private sector. Think of 8-30G. It says, we're going to give you some zoning incentives, but you, the developer, have to build and own and operate those affordable units. The cost burden's been shifted to the developer for the zoning incentives. Sometimes the zoning incentives are helpful, other times they are not. They may help, but they may not solve the fiscal challenges of the development. So there is a public policy objective when dealing with affordable housing to provide affordable housing for cost-burdened households. Financial need is common on the development side and opportunity for public-private partnerships. We did a study for WestCog a year and a half ago, 2 years ago when we completed it, that looked at, it was an affordable housing finance study, basically trying to solve the question of how can we get more housing, affordable housing built in the WestCog region. We ran a bunch of pro formas based on actual development costs in Fairfield County, and actual market rents and values. And we ran them in different topologies. We did some single family, some townhomes, some large apartments, mid-sized apartments, office to apartment conversions, and single family conversions to duplex, triplex, and quadplex. We did them in different types of communities, urban, rural, suburban. We played with scenarios that were financially assisted, and we played with unit numbers and market rate versus affordable and so forth and so on. I want to point you to a few of these. Look at single family rural, 5 units, 3 market rate, 2 at 80% AMI. We're trying to do some affordable here. And ultimately, you see the return on investments down here at 0 and 1.3%. Now, 5 units, no market rate, and you see the returns of 25.5%. Why are so many single-family residential homes built in rural communities? Because there's high demand, there's high value, and it returns. It's easy, relatively. So then we did a density bonus with some financial assistance, and we allowed 24 units, a cluster subdivision on the same site, added in 7 affordable. And look at that, we were able to achieve actually good financial feasibility numbers for returns. So we then did it with townhomes, then on the large apartments. 350 units, 245. We did this as 8-30G. Half of the units, the 30%, half of them 80% AMI, half at 60% AMI, and look at those returns. They're down in the 1%, 2 to 3%. We then did it same again with just 80% AMI units, so only 15%. And the numbers come up a little bit here. Neither one of those had financial assistance. The middle one then has financial assistance, pure 8-30G, and you can get one side of the returns up there into a good number. Office conversions actually played out really well with some financial assistance. And then actually one of the best returns or easiest things to pull off was when you convert a large single family home into a quadplex. So take a 6,000 square foot house, turn it into 4 units, and do one as affordable. And look at those returns. They're up there almost with the single family numbers. My point being is you can start to see a couple points here. You can start to see that different housing is functioning differently in the marketplace. The cost to construct and then possibly the needs that are required to subsidize and assist are going to be different across every project and across kind of every type of housing. But what's evident in here is when there's public assistance, the numbers get better on this end. Whether or not you can solve the issue, you may not be able to, but it increases the opportunity of actually getting it built, and especially when we're talking about affordable housing units. This, as I said to you, doesn't matter if I'm working with the municipality or for the developer, all the financials are given to us. This was a mixed-use development with a large housing component that also had a 10% affordability component at 80% AMI. This table came directly out of the developer's numbers. These were his calculations as to what type of financial hit he was going to take on the 10% affordable at 80% AMI. So types of units, 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, so forth, square footage, projected market rents across those units, total number of units, the total number that would be affordable, the max affordable rent, the utility allowance backed out, the net affordable rent, which is minus the utility allowance, and the rent differential per month, and the rent differential per unit over the course of a year, and the total losses. When we did the valuation, the development loses 4% of its total value at the end, what you're going to sell it for, based on the 10% affordable, that loss of income, because it's income that drives value. So they lose $305,000 per year, or $12,000 on average per unit, by providing 10% affordable. If it was 20% affordable at 80% AMI, the loss would be $600,000. At 30%, it would be $900,000. With the 25 units at 80% AMI, the development would lose $3 million over 10 years and $12 million over 40 years. Now, that 40 years is typically the length of time we require for units to be deed restricted as affordable, right? And that's why I said I typically don't like abatements that go longer than 10 years. But when we're talking about affordable housing, and if we have affordability requirements pushing out 40 years, maybe the legislature extending that term from 20 out to 30 years makes sense here for dealing with affordable housing. If under 8-30G, where you had 30% affordable, half of which at 80% AMI, and half of which were at 60% AMI, that development would lose $1.3 million per year, or 16% of its gross income. Let me ask you this. What happens to your household finances if right now I take 16% of your gross income and give it to affordable housing? It changes things, right? The money you're putting away for your kids' college education, or the money you're putting away for retirement, or whatever, it changes those numbers dramatically. Well, it changes the operating costs and performance of a development out to 40 years with those deed restrictions. So tax abatements and fixing agreements can be structured to offset losses per year for affordable units and so forth. And I'll talk a bit more about that when we get elsewhere. So some considerations: affordable housing land use policy shifts the cost burden over to the private sector. Basically says developer has to pay for it. Zoning incentives, often density bonuses, are not enough to offset the actual costs, especially longer term. If I go back to the previous slide and I go back to the large apartments, 8-30G, 350 units, all these 8-30G units, and you see the finances here, I would argue due to the high percentage, the 30% affordable required, and the large percentage of those being at 60% AMI, is pulling down the financial feasibility. And I would argue that's why 8-30G has never performed as well as everyone hoped it would, that not as many housing units have been built. Now, I know 8-30G is controversial for a whole bunch of reasons. Put that aside, just think about it fiscally. And basically, the market rate units, even with the density bonuses, can't carry the large number of affordable units. It makes it really challenging. Now, I do work with an affordable housing developer and 8-30G units. And, I've asked them outright, like, how do you make your numbers work? And it's basic things like, well, he bought land a long, long time ago and has sat on it for a long, long time. And therefore, his land costs are next to nothing. There's other things too, but it's just like they've been in this for a long period of time, and their circumstance, they can make it work. That doesn't mean everyone can make it work, especially if they're paying a premium for the land. So that was my question. How would your household finances turn out? The loss of income is real and can have negative consequences, such as deferred maintenance that goes beyond the initial development. If the development's generating $300,000 less per year, in year 20, when you start needing to do boilers and roofs and things like that, the development's cash starved. It doesn't have that liquidity that it would otherwise if those affordable units weren't there. I'm not being critical. I'm just being honest in the kind of the fiscal perspective of the challenge here. So a tax abatement or fixing agreement is not a giveaway of corporate welfare if the development will not or does not get built, right? It's either it's not going to happen, or you can incentivize it to happen. And by providing that incentive, you now have those new tax dollars from the development to play with to help it along. So some simple pro forma analysis. This is one of my favorite developments because my role in this was actually kind of unique. I got to be truly in the middle on this one. So it was known as One Park in West Hartford. It was an old convent. Large existing facility. Developer was going to convert it into almost 400 apartment units. It had a historic preservation component to it that was driving up costs on construction. And the town also wanted 10% affordable, 10% of the units affordable at 8% AMI. And the developer, when he first met with the town and they told him about the historic preservation stuff, he was like, let's see, we'll try and figure that out. Yeah, we can make that work. Then they were like, we want the affordable units. And he came back to them. He's like, you guys are killing me. I can't make this work. And we're never going to get this thing financed. And the town was like, well, we want those units. He's like, well, then you're going to have to participate. I need some type of tax abatement. And West Hartford had never done a tax abatement before for commercial purposes or for housing purposes. We were called, and basically the developer escrowed funds to the town to hire Goldman York to hold their hand through the tax abatement process. So we were being paid by the developer, but we were the client of the town. And basically the developer turned over all their financials to us. And then we test those. We run the developer's financials, which are shown here, and then we test them against our own performance. If we were doing this, what would our numbers be? Basically to see if the developer's numbers are realistic, or are they padding the numbers they're giving to us, to try and get an abatement. And basically, overall, while there's some differences, the models are very similar. So we're confident in the developer's numbers. We then started running various models to figure out how to best structure a tax abatement. And we could show the changes in returns and running each of the models. We had front loaded one with like 5 years at 100% and tried to get it cut off by year 7, and it wasn't working well. Ultimately, we figured out the best model, the best terms or structure was this 100% for 3 years, then 80% in year 4, 70 and 5, and then 50% through years 6 through 10. And when we did that, it created the best financial circumstance for the developer, the way his numbers look to shop it for investors. And it also created a good circumstance for the municipality in the tax revenues that would come in. And this is basically showing the fiscal impact analysis with the abatement. Years 4 for the municipality are negative, and then it goes slightly positive in year 5, and then remains positive through the rest of it. And then that's year 11 when it's back at full taxes. The interesting thing here that I have to note is this negative was on paper. These costs in years 1 through 4 were years 1 through 3 were going to be absorbed with no financial impact on the town. Just on paper, it shows up negative. Year 4, maybe a little financial impact on the town, but then it flips positive. Ultimately, this project was approved for the abatement, and ultimately it got built. And it's been a great success, and all parties have been happy with it. This was a mixed-use development. Sorry, I've got to skip ahead because, yeah. This was a mixed use of development, just another similar situation. I think we were working for the developer, helping them with the town. Yeah. And basically, developers' numbers, Goldman York tested their numbers. We presented this all to the town. You can see how big this development is. It's almost a $200 million project. So this was actually done over a 15-year period, not just a 10-year period. And once again, was able to be structured in a way that kept the town positive in all years. Sorry, this is the 10-year abatement. They ended up agreeing on, I put the wrong slide in. They ended up doing a tax fixing agreement. They just fixed the property at a low value for the 15-year period, and meaning it would pay lower taxes than it would have otherwise. And that was actually the cleanest way to do it, was just fix a low value, and it worked out best for everyone. And the town got a net like 400,000 extra in taxes per year across those 15 years that they wouldn't have otherwise have, even though they gave away like $1 million a year in taxes to offset those costs. So then this is another multifamily, mixed use development with a 10% affordable component. The town was insistent on the affordable units at 80% AMI. Once again, testing the numbers, their numbers, Goldman York numbers, and then working out the various assumptions for the tax abatements. The improvement on the return on investments by doing the tax abatement, and then the numbers there. Cash cow in the first year due to development impact fees, essentially permitting, one-time permitting fees of over 800,000. 4 years negative, and then ratcheting up more and more positive in each of the remaining years out to 10. The way this was sold, we were working for the developer. The way this was sold to the municipality was the one-time development fees, almost $1 million in development fees in year one would offset these losses in years, 3, 4, and 2, 3, 4, and 5, 2, 3, and 4. So ultimately, it was approved and it did move forward. The fun thing here is that table you saw previously was exactly from this development. This is where they were showing the developer had calculated out these losses. We were able to then test these numbers. We were able to go and sit down with the town and say to them, look, we agree you need the affordable housing. We want to provide the affordable housing, but we're losing this much money per year on those affordable units on the operating side. And we ran full pro formas out. And we're able to actually come to an agreement on what became this tax abatement. So let me wrap up with some property tax incentive policies. There's nothing in section 12.65B that actually says you need a tax incentive policy. So I'd say the majority of communities have gone forward and developed policies to frame what their programs would be. There are communities, though, that I've dealt with that have just said, we have this authority under 12-65B. We will just create, a motion under our authorities under 12-65B and enter into an engagement, an abatement with a applicant. So I just want you to be clear on that. There's kind of both spectrums. The no policy whatsoever will handle it on an as-needed basis, or those that frame a policy. Words of caution on framing the policy. I'll get to that. So you can create a policy, or you can enter into an agreement for qualified affordable housing units and developments that provide them. So my point there is you could develop a policy just around the affordable units that we are going to abate taxes related to those units, or that you will consider developments with affordable units for tax abatements, that you apply the abatements to the whole development, not just the affordable units. Abating the taxes on the qualified units or fixing the taxes at reduced rates can assist to subsidize losses in revenues from the affordable units. In general, on multifamily developments, I find, depending on the local mill rate, the taxes per unit are typically between $4,000 and $5,000. If I go back to here, sorry, it's back further than I thought I was going because it's all the way back to here. Oh, no, it was right there. I skipped it. But $12,000 per unit per year was being lost in this development at 80% AMI. If we come back down to here, and there's $4,000 to $5,000 to play with per unit in taxes, you can chip into pretty well into that lost revenue. And that's just if you're using those affordable units. If you spread it across the entire development, you do have the money there to actually offset those losses. So following the following framework is a framework for thinking about the qualified affordable housing tax abatement policies and how it is structured and incentivized. My recommendation is policies should be flexible in their structure and utilization to avoid binding the town or the applicant to tax abatements that may not improve financial feasibility. This is actually me saying something else in a nice way. A number of years ago, I was hired by a town to help them write a policy for tax abatements, both for economic development purposes and for housing purposes. And those were the objectives: economic development and housing. And I drafted a first draft, put it before the committee that was working on it. And I want to say they gutted it, but they didn't. They actually quadrupled it in size when they gave it back to me with comments. Because they then decided that they wanted to include Davis-Bacon and livable wages. They wanted to include local subcontractor requirements. They wanted to include local employee requirements on the construction side. And those are valuable policy objectives. I'm not opposed to them. But they weren't the objectives going into creating a tax abatement program. The objectives were to create economic development and to subsidize housing, specifically affordable housing, right? Well, if you add in all those other things they wanted to do, you increase the cost of construction on those housing units, right? And now there's not enough taxes in the abatement to overcome the high costs of construction. So essentially adding those things in was undermining the intent of affordable housing. So that's my point of being flexible. If you can structure a policy that truly just stays focused on affordable housing and affordable units, and that is aimed to work with a developer to figure out a way on how to make it work and get those units built, the better you will be. The more you try and write into that policy, the harder it's going to be to pull it off and the less likely you'll have success. Structure abatements to fix the current tax value for paid taxes. So the town is still paid current value where 100% abatement may be granted. This is a pretty standard practice. If you have a parcel that's already paying $50,000 a year in taxes, they're coming in for a redevelopment, they're gonna do, in the tax abatement, structure the deal so that the town still gets that $50,000 per year. Even if you're giving away 100% of the new taxes, you still get the 50,000. That way you don't lose revenue in the deal. So that's a pretty standard practice. I recommend, strongly recommend doing that. And allow tax abatements to be requested for entire development, not just a qualified unit. Such a policy could offer different percentages of abatements or fixing agreements in terms and numbers of years. And percent of value of the abatements for the market rate housing units than the qualified units. If you've got a 300 unit development and 60 are going to be affordable, allowing abatements across the whole development just gives you more tax dollars to play with to ultimately help the subsidy of those affordable units. So yes, you can limit and just focus on will abate taxes on the affordable units, and those will help. But you can play a bigger role if you consider the entire development. Consider flexible sliding scale abatement structure that utilizes the numbers of years of the abatement is available for and the percent value of abatement offered considered against the percentage of qualified affordable units provided and the household incomes. Essentially, what I'm saying here is the more affordable units you provide, the higher abatements you could get, right? Or the longer number of years you could get. And if you're willing to do lower incomes, 60% AMI or 50% AMI, then you're also able to get a higher percentage of abatement and a longer number of years. So you can play with those things to kind of incentivize what you want. 80% AMI is always going to be the easiest to pull off. The deeper the lower the income levels, the deeper the subsidy is going to need to be. Incentives for tax abatements could offer owners of existing naturally occurring affordable multifamily housing units to deed restrict units. This came from some of our work with Westcog and looking at ways of incentivizing existing affordable units to actually be counted within the affordable realm. You could use tax incentives as a way to incentivize owners of existing units to put them into affordable housing. There are circumstances where existing units are cash poor. They need renovations. And if you can identify those willing owners, cutting a deal to provide tax incentives that improves their cash flow with the agreement that they convert those units into affordable units and also reinvest into the property that needed improvements. It can be a way to incentivize it. The tax fixing, I find very interesting, especially with that development I noted to you over the 15 years. Sometimes just a simple tax fixing agreement. So I said, let's say the per unit taxes are going to be $5,000 per unit. Coming up with a tax fixing agreement that says they pay $2,000 per unit in taxes over 20 years. That gives them $3,000 tax abatement. The fixing agreement sometimes can be cleaner and easier to digest than the percentages, playing out over years and so forth. So in some instances, I have become favorable to just negotiating fixing agreements rather than trying to figure out those sliding scales of percentiles. I believe that is it, and I'm more than happy to take questions from you guys.
Thank you so much. That was actually incredibly helpful. I feel like I just learned a ton of things that, and I think have a number of really interesting ideas embedded in that. I particularly want to note this idea of tax incentives for naturally occurring affordable housing that we want to preserve, because this is a particular issue in Norwalk that we have been thinking a lot about. And I'm interested in part too, because I think that becomes a way then of protecting existing owners as well, right? They can afford to stay in the unit. So let me open it up to committee members if folks have follow-up questions that you want to ask. And then I've got some of my own as per usual. Ms. Edie.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Don, for your presentation. It was informative. You might have answered this already. I was just curious, the 12 to 18% return on investment, does that go by area, or is that just across the board that those numbers need to look like that?
Yeah, that's kind of across the board. So whether it's a developer building in Texas or up here in Connecticut, they're kind of looking at a minimum of 12. We've had some developers push back on us lately on those numbers and say it's more like 15 to 20% today with the volatility in the market. We're still holding to our 12 to 15. We don't think it's pushed that high. But that's a point I didn't make that you give me the opportunity to make. When you're talking about investment and investors, their money can go anywhere. So it's much easier to get a return on your investment in a hot Atlanta market or Dallas Fort Worth market than it is in, say, Connecticut's Hartford market, recognizing you guys are in a hot market. But just remember, those investment dollars are competing with other places where the finances look a lot better than they do up here. And so there's always a challenge, but it's across the board.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Another question I had was, for your mixed use developments, are you always including, amenities in those plans? Because doesn't that raise the cost even more?
It does. At the end of the day, we kind of believe, we as Goldman York and the developers strongly believe, and I think the municipalities believe now too, for developments to prosper in this day and age, they need to be amenity rich. The fact is, consumers want those amenities. And a development without the amenities isn't going to fare as well, most likely long term. So yeah, we recognize there's a cost in them, but they kind of still need to be there. So
Okay, and the last thing, if I was reading your chart correctly, um, it looked like there was more return on investment for building single family homes and converting single family homes to duplexes and triplexes versus the multifamily units of 240 units and stuff like that, right? Safe to
yeah,
say
so
that.
so single family detached, just the typical suburban subdivision, yeah, it returns the easiest and the best. It's really hard to do affordability within it, and I typically don't recommend trying to tackle affordability on the home ownership side. The most surprising thing to us in that study when we ran all those detailed development pro formas was the conversions of the single families at how well they came back. And we just that was a shot in the dark. We just said, well, it's Fairfield County. You have a lot of really big homes. I knew of a developer that bought a big home and was looking to do some alternative with it. And we just kind of said, well, what if we took an $8,000, functionally obsolete McMansion and carved it into four 2,000 square foot units? How would that play out in a development pro forma? And it came back really positive. We were just like, wow, because the structure's there, the foundation's there, the exterior's there, the land is there. You're not having to kind of create all that. And that's why they pencil out really well. So,
Okay, okay, great. Thank you so much.
yep.
Other folks with questions? Okay. While folks are thinking about it, I have a couple, and then so I want to start with following up on that last point. I'm intrigued by that. I genuinely don't know how many properties we have in Norwalk that really fit that profile. I feel like I would love for you to be going to our surrounding towns and peddling that idea, right? I feel like can we send you out on a mission to Darien, to Weston, to Westport, to New Canaan? Because I think that seems like a place, Wilton in particular, which is actually grappling, because of ASML with a real need in a way they haven't been before. I'd love to see
Right.
that. We'll have to think. It's actually an interesting proposition I'd like to think about if we have properties in Norwalk that are sort of would be good candidates for that. I think the tricky thing remains that even if you do that, you've added, 3 units essentially, which is still it's a small. But I mean, this is the thing where we continue to grapple with. Folks really want to maintain neighborhood character. We do have a lot of our property in Norwalk that has a suburban feel, but we have to find some way of kind of, the urban core cannot bear all of the growth that we need. So it's an intriguing idea, and I appreciate you kind of introducing that. Um, I guess this was also helpful to think about, and I particularly appreciated sort of your thoughts on flexibility, and I think that that makes sense. You know, the idea with 1265B being that we have general guidelines that we provide to planning and zoning, but it is negotiated sort of developmentally specific to development because, as you laid out, the economics of each sort of project are going to be a little different, and it makes sense, I think, for us to not be um, tied to a rigid set of incentives when in fact the idea is to figure out what would do the most to get the most affordable housing into a particular unit or to a particular development. I wondered, you didn't really show any examples. We've been playing a lot with this question off and on of should, Norwalk is at 10%. Should we be
Yep.
more at like 15 or 20? So that's not getting all the way up to the, 30/30 of 830G, but it would be sort of a larger amount. Have you seen anyone do kind of the 15 to 20 range and how the economics of that work out?
In general, I mean, it's pretty, the more units you require, the harder it becomes on the financial feasibility side. And that's why I kind of pointed out with 8-30G, I think it's underperformed.
Mhm.
The 30% is too high, and the share of 60% AMI is too high. I think if 8-30G were at 20%, 15 at 80% AMI, and 5 at 60% AMI, you would see a lot more 8-30Gs. Now, maybe everyone's content with that, not seeing more 8-30Gs. I don't know,
Not
but it's
necessarily here. I think Norwalk is in a
right. No,
very,
no,
yeah.
I get that.
Hmm.
Uh, Other communities like you mentioned, the Westons, the New Canaans, so the status quo, I think, may work to everyone's favor in some ways. But specifically, as percents go up, it gets harder and harder. I usually advise communities if you're trying to increase uh, to get to 10% AMI, the 10% threshold of 8-30G, or if you're already, I've got one client community that's at like 10.8% or whatever. I usually say a minimum of 12. You always want to be, do some inclusionary zoning provisions, do 12%. That way you're never heading backwards. You can keep the momentum moving forwards. 12 to 15, I think, is the best range, somewhere in there. When you start pushing above 15%, it gets more challenging. Now, that's once again, stronger market conditions down in Norwalk. You guys could probably push for 12% without a lot of the fiscal impacts, uh, meaning you may not have to incentivize at 12%. But maybe at 15%, you need to start incentivizing. That's where a tax abatement comes in. Or maybe if you want to push for 18 or 20%, that's where you really start to say, how much are we willing to put in here?
Hmm.
How big of a tax abatement? Are we going 30 years at 100% on the affordable units? I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying those are the questions you need to start asking. And figuring out how to make it work. But the lower the percent,
Hmm.
but the highest number you want to strive for is kind of the best place to be. And I usually find 15% as kind of that area. So
Okay, that's very helpful. And I guess the last thing that this seems sort of obvious, but also I think in some ways it's not necessarily obvious in the community conversations about this. So um what are our other options, right? So if we want to have more affordable housing in Norwalk, and in particular, let's talk about our 60% AMI, which, as you say, are challenging to, get even with the tax abatements, and certainly without them are virtually impossible. You know, what's the other choice? How do we get units that meet the need? Because if you think about 60% AMI, that's still 30% of our population, right, is in that range. So what are our other choices for getting units other than working with private developers to incentivize them to do those?
and that's another area where I think, as a planner in planning, we spend a lot of time patting ourselves on the back for things like 8-30G and getting affordable housing built. But at the same time, I can be very critical of that. Uh, The census data shows, just analyze incomes and housing in your census data. The greatest need for affordable housing is below 50% AMI. And truly, the greatest need is actually below 30% AMI, which is essentially the federal poverty rate. Zoning cannot solve affordability below 60% AMI. It's not going to happen through zoning. So in some ways, I chuckle when we're talking about 60% and 80% AMI. We are truly talking about middle income houses. Pew's definition of what's middle class in America is between 55,000 and 170,000. That's the middle class. It's the best definition I've found. It's really hard to define, but 60% AMI is in the middle class, right? So we're talking about, we debate, we fight, we argue, we do all these things about affordable housing through zoning. That's really talking about the middle class, and we're missing that population that's below. Zoning is not going to solve it. A simple tax abatement, not simple, but a tax abatement's not going to solve it either. That's why CHFA has a bunch of programs. That's why DOH has programs. That's why there's LIHTC and the low-income housing tax credits. And most important, that's why there's voucher programs. And voucher programs are the best. The person gets to go where they want with their voucher, so long as fair housing is abided by. Super expensive, so we underfund it, and it's a lottery, right? So, so I'm not sure I have a great solution for lower, other than, if the tax abatement's not enough to get 50% AMI housing built, let's say, then you have to start looking at what role can Norwalk play. Are you willing to be a partner with the developer and actually put equity in? Are you willing to help with going to CHFA and DOH and, helping with the LIHTC applications that so few developers want to take on because they're extremely challenging? You've got to start looking at other ways, and it's going to be costly.
And I cannot say enough about how much I appreciate the honesty on that, because I think that that is a lot of what's missing in some ways from this conversation, right? There's this fantasy out there that this problem is solvable without enormous investments of resources, and that it is solvable through, a sort of a this, that, or the other. And the truth is, we can make a small dent, and, through zoning, I think these kind of abatements are really provide a particular opportunity. And as you say, the middle class matters, right? We need to make investments in affordability for the middle class. That is an important place to invest. But I do think it is really incumbent upon us to understand that we are not going to be able to abate our way out of the challenges for a large chunk of our residents, 30% of our residents, right? And that we need to get real about what that is going to potentially require.
Yeah, I think it's also in the context, regional scale, in the context of Norwalk and where you are, abating the middle class becomes even more important, I think, because the middle class is really priced out. Much of the middle class is priced out of your region. So providing at 80% AMI, I think has a lot more value in Norwalk than, say, it does up here in the Hartford region, based on that kind of regional context. So
yeah, I think that's very, very helpful. And I'm really proud of what Norwalk has done so far. I mean, I think it is important to stress that a lot of our abatements so far, existing ones, even if they are maybe not as targeted as we might like to see them, they have allowed a great deal of, building at the 80% level in a way that I don't think would have happened otherwise. So other committee members, I know we're pushing up on our time here, but Jalen, or Mr. Seed.
Yeah, I just had a question of how I know we won't technically lose revenue, and there's ways to fix it with the tax abatements, so we don't lose revenue. But is there anything that's out there to help us gain the revenue? Because if we're adding in units, we're going to be adding in revenue that's going to be a cost burden on like the schools and other things because we're adding people to the city. So how do we kind of combat that? Because we have a growing city, like we do now, we're gonna have to spend more on education, our streets, we got more people on the streets, and kind of puts us in a bind where we don't have the tax revenue that we need to fund our the infrastructure in our schools.
Yeah, so I'm just going to throw up here very quickly one of our slides again, just because I think it's worthwhile in the context of that question. This was the One Park development in West Hartford. And as you see here, these bottom tables, this is the revenue. So the tax abatement by percentage, the residential property taxes that would be coming in from the development, the personal property taxes, which is essentially motor vehicles, right? And then the total tax amount. But we were pushing that up against a fiscal analysis, fiscal impact analysis of expenditures. Cost of general government services required in dollars by these new units, and the cost of Board of Education, new school enrollments coming out of this development. So when you see the net fiscal positive up here, that's taking into account the expenditures going out and the new tax revenues. So it's not like here, yes, the abatement's going, there's no new revenues coming in. But starting in this year, new revenues are coming in, and they're above and beyond your existing revenues and the new cost that you're absorbing from that development. And I did provide this. Who did I email it to? It was Michelle, right? Was it Michelle I emailed?
Yes, I'll send it
Yes.
out to everybody.
Yeah, so everyone will have a copy of it, so you can read the greater detail in the slides that I know I went through quickly. So.
Thank you. I know we don't normally allow attendees to ask questions at this juncture, but committee members, would you be okay with taking a question from Ms. Tabachnik, who, as folks may know, is a member of our Planning and Zoning Commission, who grapples, I think, pretty directly with some of these questions? Would folks be okay with that? Okay. Ms. Jędruski, would you mind promoting Ms. Tabachnik so she could ask her question? Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Chair. I wanted to say thank you. I came a little late to the presentation. I appreciate hearing your perspective that in this region, we perhaps could be setting something like 80% AMI and 10% of units as the cost of doing business, and that it is the increased percentages or deeper AMI that get the density bonuses or tax abatements. I think that's a question that's been raised by the community as to whether we really need, or like to what degree do we still need to incentivize development in this area, because we seem quite popular. My question is, for the 12 to 15% ROI number, to what extent does that hold or not hold when working with nonprofit developers, or when working with developers that are able to use LIHTC credits in part with the workforce housing regulations?
Yeah, those deals are structured so different on the nonprofit side and on the LIHTC side that basically the idea of return on investment kind of goes out the window, and it's more of a development service fee, that they're looking at a fee for service kind of per year over the operation of the development that they earn as income above and beyond just say the property maintenance and stuff. So it really is a different creature than private sector market development. And I'm just not prepared to answer in greater detail than that right now. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Appreciate it. I see Mr. Kleppen's hand, and then Ms. Dunn, I see your hand.
Oh, Ms. Dunn can go first. I can wait.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Dunn?
So one of my questions is, I understand why a developer wants to, they're in that business and building buildings, but we do have a lot of homes that you kind of touched on a little bit that we could support with tax abatements as landlords and stuff. We have a lot of houses that are being used as rooming houses, two-family house. Like we just had one, was a three-family house with, 20 people in it, 20 rooming houses, rooms. How do people go about investing and bringing up to code so that, either bringing those landlords into compliance or making an area where those homes are really prevalent? We have huge neighborhoods, areas where, if we invested in bringing those houses up to code with the idea that they were going to provide lower income rents, because they're also charging huge amount of rents for these rooms, illegal rooms. And I know that's aside from the whole developer big picture thing, but how have other communities done that? I'd like a little insight into that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually a more complex question than I'm prepared to answer right now, but I can answer it. I would actually offer to you guys, if you want, bring me back in the fall. I'll do another presentation on kind of how you reposition a neighborhood and its housing market, because it's something I've spent a fair portion of my career doing. And I really think it's a valuable perspective to think about, but it would take another slide presentation, not just me answering off the cuff. So,
Just ask you a quick question about that though. Are there
sure.
communities that exist where people have done that, or that are models that we could look at? And does it raise the quality of life for the people overall in the neighborhood with the
So
amenities stuff?
there's communities that have done it, and I could point to that have figured out how to engage property owners and landlords, bring them on board, and get them making investments that they previously weren't making to improve housing. Those I can provide examples of. Oswego, New York, the Oswego Renaissance Association, ORA, probably is the best program in the country that has done that. Tying in the affordability components, that I don't have a good place to go to for you, a good example to say that someone's been successful in doing both of them. But I could put thought into it and come back to you in the fall with more on it.
I was just wondering, because I know like Detroit has done some of that too, and I was just wondering how successful, the outcomes are too. So,
Yeah.
I wish we had land prices like Detroit to work with.
That makes I just did a meeting with an organization here in Connecticut. We met with a land bank out in I think it was Minnesota. And at the end of the meeting, I turned to my client organization here. It was just like, we don't have the abandoned, dilapidated, vacant lot syndrome that these other places have, which is essentially low land value. We don't have that. So actually, pulling that off becomes really hard in Connecticut. So.
we do have a lot of those houses that are truly dragging down the overall value of other homes, and landlords are making a lot of money off of people that really should be given more of a break than they.
Absolutely, but less the abandonment. But yeah, you're right. The deferred maintenance product is definitely there. So.
Well, and I really appreciate that offer. I think that is something that we will follow up on, because this is as Ms. Dunn identifies there, this is a core question of ours. And I think it does tie into the point you raised at the end about the possibility of doing incentives and abatements for naturally occurring affordable housing if people are willing to then deed restrict it. And do we have opportunities to kind of do some kind of program where we're offering maintenance in exchange for restrictions on affordability, and can we create something that combines those components? Would be, I think, a very interesting thing to explore.
I think it would raise the value of the properties around it and bring in more tax dollars from the, even the single family homes or true 2 and 3 family homes, I think it would rising tide raises all ships kind of for the neighborhoods. So that would be good.
Yep.
It definitely does, but I think the tricky thing then we have to grapple with is that in rising the tides, do you force people out, right? Does those rising tides drown certain people and move them out? And I think that's really the ongoing challenge we have in Norwalk at large right now, right? I mean, that is everywhere. But I think it's a good question, Ms. Dunn. I think we really should explore it and see what we can find out, what our options are, right? I mean, I will go look up the Oswego Renaissance after we get off this call. Because it is certainly a challenging question. With, as you've mentioned, other components, safety components,
Yep.
blight components, other parts of it that are not just this affordable question, but are have other health and safety concerns attached to it.
Raising kids in safe, homes.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. So that would help as opposed to just, building more buildings that, anyway. Now I feel about that. Okay, that's it. I'm done. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah.
Thanks,
And Ms. Dembowski-Eichner and Steve Hope, just to add on to what Ms. Dunn mentioned. And so if you could talk about, when you come back, about blighted property as well, severely blighted properties that have been abandoned. And so what kinds of things could we do as a city to address that as well? And
Yeah,
if you have any.
have me back to speak on neighborhood investments. I have a lot to offer there, and that will cover the abandonment, that will cover the deferred maintenance, that will cover a wide swath of stuff to give you guys some ideas.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. Ms. Young, did you have another question or no? Okay. Mr. Kleppen.
Sure. Just wanted to point out a few things for the committee's
Oh, we lost you.
kind of edification on things. Can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Yes.
Yep. Mhm.
Yeah, I'm losing my internet signal for whatever reason. Sorry about that. We end up using SMI, not AMI, for our inclusionary zoning. So that is a lower, ends up with resulting with lower rents and lower income levels for people on that scale. I can have, if you haven't seen it yet, I can get you the list of properties that have taken advantage of the enterprise zone incentives. Very few actually are at this stage. So, a lot of the newer developments, people always complain about that, but they're actually not taking advantage of that. One thing, and to Mr. Seed's point, he brought up about, which is a good question about impacts as a result of developments on, could potentially be perceived as negative impacts in terms of like school children, impacts on infrastructure, police, fire, et cetera, those kind of things. We're actually doing an analysis of that now, and I think we'll have something to share with everyone probably by the end of the summer. But I can tell you, for example, looking at part of Waypoint, one of the buildings there generates $4 million annual tax revenue, and based on the number of school kids in the schools, it's only $750,000. So it's a big delta there.
Sorry, Steve, you cut out on those very important numbers. So what was the revenue it generated versus the costs?
Sure. And if I'm speaking now, if you can't hear me, then I'll stop attempting to. So we were looking just at like one, for example, which was a pretty significant one, was one of the Waypoint buildings generates about $4 million in annual revenue, where the cost to educate the kids that actually go to school from that development is only $750,000. So that one is a pretty big jump alone. But we have a whole analysis we're working on, which we'll share later this summer.
Terrific. Thank you. I think that is very helpful to this sort of ongoing conversation. Again, I think part of what I really appreciated about Mr. Pullen's presentation was kind of the moving from our sense of things and our instincts on things to actually looking at the hard numbers and how they really do play out. And I think that's very helpful, Mr. Hoppen, to have a specific Norwalk analysis for the buildings that have received abatements. And I do also think it is important to remind folks, as you did, that many of the most recent developments have not, in fact, taken advantage of these abatements, which again is, I think, a signal to this committee that we have an opportunity to offer different abatements than the existing opportunity zones that are more targeted to the specific gaps we're seeing, right? So I think, Mr. Poland, your presentation included 2 bedrooms a little bit. We have a huge gap in family size, 3 and 4, 2, 3, 4 bedroom. And one of the questions that we're interested in is, can we incentivize more 3 bedrooms? And, I think from your presentation, it's pretty obvious that in order to do that, we, very potentially might need to offer specific abatements targeted at kind of getting units of larger size done. But that would be something that we could potentially make it feasible for a developer to do that with the right incentive, could actually get us to those kind of units we're looking to have built in. I know it is 7:30. I know I say every time that we're going to try to stay on time, but there's just too much to talk about here. It's too valuable and rich. Do folks have, we've got 1 minute. Anyone have a closing question? Anything further? Ms. Edie? I can always rely on you to have other good questions.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I love it.
Real quick, we talked about the conversion of single family to duplexes, but what do you think about, real quick, conversion of commercial property to home or apartments? Expensive or feasible?
That's also in that table. We looked at that as a scenario, and it's actually a very financially feasible scenario. The biggest challenge with it is the existing building size and configuration. Some commercial buildings convert very easily. Some commercial buildings just will not convert, and they're not financially feasible. But if you find the right buildings, they can be very financially feasible and a great opportunity for affordability. So they're worthy to look at.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. My final comment, as many of you saw, a significant housing bill passed the General Assembly, the House of the General Assembly. It is now being considered by the Senate. I have spent a bunch of time today trying to get caught up on it. There's a lot in it. Some of it I have some questions about. A lot of it I'm tremendously excited about. I'm particularly excited to see a genuine attempt at getting a fair use kind of standard across the state that really sets expectations that it cannot be Norwalk alone that bears the burden. But I do really encourage all of you, given this is something we passionately care about, to please take a look at the bill. It's HB 5002. And get your comments into the Senate. It is expected that they will be debating it shortly if they haven't started already. And it is the first significant attempt to grapple with housing in the state in quite some time. So I do really ask all of us who care deeply about it to give some thought to it and get your comments in. And we can potentially talk about the impact of it next month. So thank you all. As always, thank you again so much, Mr. Poland. I really appreciate your coming. I really appreciate your offer to come back to us. I think we will look forward to talking to you again in the future. And I would take a motion to adjourn. All right, all those in favor? All right, terrific. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.